Darren Miller, your host of the RevAmp podcast. Today, we are excited to host Semir Jahic. He is the Senior Manager of Sales Engineering and Operations EMEA at Clari, a company that he'll tell you more about and can tell you much more interesting facts. But the company is hot, and what Semir does is super interesting. So I was really excited when he said he'd be interested in speaking on our podcast. Semir, thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me, Barry. Good to be here.
Our pleasure. So Semir, I already said in the intro, maybe you could tell us a bit about yourself, and you could tell us a bit more of Clari, and soon we'll deep dive into what it means to be a sales engineer and to do operations.
Yeah, my pleasure. So my name is Semir Jahic. As you said, I've been at Clari for over 2 years now, spearheading the European expansion. We'll dive into that. I think what would be interesting for people is the background is, I'm from Switzerland originally, so that's why it's not an American or British accent that you have on this podcast from me. I grew up in Switzerland, small village, went to Accenture and did to work in the Salesforce practice after my university degree. So that's where I got exposed to CRM and the cloud. Then after that, I worked at Salesforce in London. And after that, I thought I want to jump on the startup train, want to do something exciting, and became the very first sales engineer for Clari in EMEA and part of the landing team with a few reps and SDRs. And we started building the market here with Clari, which was a brand new solution. We were founded around 9 years ago in the Silicon Valley from the need that there had to be more than a combination of CRM, spreadsheets, and BI tools. And operations people and sales leaders were really looking for something to bring all that revenue data together, where you collaborate more closely, you understand what's happening, and you can close more deals faster, make it all just more connected, more predictable, and more efficient. And that's what Clari does. That's what we've been doing for 9 years and over 2 years now in Europe. And it's been a wild ride, to say the least.
That was a fantastic description of Clari. I'm sure your marketing team is very proud.
I hope so. Thank you.
So I think there's a few interesting topics for our listeners to be that we're going to cover. One is that you went from sales engineering to operations, but two, also that you helped expand the team globally and the product and the go-to-market globally. I should be more specific. Meaning you were brought in as the first sales engineer in Europe, and the fact that you I guess have from Switzerland and you're more familiar with the landscape, you also are strategically helping the teams go across the world and across Europe and across other parts. So I think that's a very interesting topic. But I think let's start at sales engineering. What exactly is your day-to-day? And then how that, I guess, led to more operations perspective. So first, let's start with sales engineering.
Yeah, perfect. So for those who don't know, sales engineers or solution engineers, pre-sales consultants, they're oftentimes the unsung heroes in sales cycles. We're behind the scenes, making sure that the solution that we are promising actually stands up to the expectation of a prospect or customer. And, demos are often done by SEs and many other things. So it's a very multifaceted role. And I got into this after Accenture at Salesforce, doing the SE role for a few years, and then at Clari. And it really helped me do a decent job at Clari when we were starting, was to have that background in Salesforce and to know what happens after people buy, because I was implementing Salesforce as well, implementing solutions. And I just loved it. I just loved it at a startup as well, because, we would break into new countries, first customers in Israel, so where you are today, or in Austria or in Ireland. And it's just super exciting to be the SE at the forefront. So it's not just to demonstrate the product or to showcase a certain module or to go through a security review before somebody buys a software. But it was much more than that when you're part of the first 4 or 5 people that are in a new region. First time outside the US for Clari 2 years ago, it was all about feeding back and having a very tight feedback loop with the product team, with the marketing team, with the operations teams in the US. And that really over time has evolved to become a formal part of my title now and what I do every day. So I do the SE role, helping our sales teams win more deals, position the product, demo, but I also feed back and I say, hey, this is what's working in this market. Hey, this is the product gap that we have specifically in Europe that's a bit different to the US, because you're based in Israel, I'm based in the UK, and we all know not everything works exactly the same way across the world as it does in California and Silicon Valley. And that's been the fun part of having that operations hat on and learning every day.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I know Israel, we try to duplicate the Valley and American. I think we actually do a solid job. One thing that is very different is that our language is right to left. If the language is important, usually most Israelis in high tech read English, but I know that's definitely a factor for tech companies when they're a product factor. What are some of the other, and this is just off the cusp, but what are some of the other like product features? You don't have to be so specific, but like what are some big gaps that people thought maybe the rest of the world wouldn't have an issue with? But for software, they actually do have that issue. From a hardware perspective, I used to sell actually musical instruments, and we sold an electric guitar, and one time we sold on Amazon. One time our manufacturer ran out of American outlets, and he just he just sent to America ones with outlets that only worked in the UK. And that was a disaster.
Yes, I can imagine. Oh my goodness.
And yeah, and then hardware, and like we even tested it beforehand, because you have to, but you only get a sample, and it was only like 5% of the box that had this of the 10,000 shipment. So that for hardware was a harder fix afterwards. But I'm curious some of the software things that you've seen, some of the software trends where there's a big gap from the States and the rest of the world.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a number of things as you evolve as a company and get more into the enterprise, for instance, or more deeper into certain sectors, different things become important. One thing that I knew would be important, and we've constantly started feeding back the product, is the explainability of things. So we have a certain element of AI in our projections. CROs can tell in week 2 or 3 where they will likely land at the end of the quarter. And in the US, people just love that. They jump at it. They like very open to new things. And when you start to sell the same capability, maybe in Germany or in Holland, for instance, they ask, well, how does this AI really work? Can you tell me more? What's the science behind it? And the explainability of how your solution actually works and how you position it, really critical as well. And that's something you have to build into the product and how it can explain, like, how does this exactly work? What's in the box that delivers this? But then there's also hands-on stuff. We all are big fans, of course, of GDPR and privacy and security. So I think that is something I think every software company has learned or is learning probably very early when they start internationally expanding about how do we get GDPR compliance in, how do we follow all the privacy rules across different countries. And I think there was a learning curve for us as well in pursuing that path. So that's just 2 examples of the nuances that you might not know if you're somewhere in California when you first expand into the European market.
Yeah, it actually reminds me a little of like when you were talking about the role of a sales engineer. I'm a product marketer. It sounds even like there's a lot of overlapping features. Like what is the messaging, and the explainability thing is like very product marketing like kind of insight. So it's really interesting. I think this might be the first time I'm talking in a professional level with a sales engineer to hear some of the similarities there. It's super interesting.
Cool. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a multifaceted role, that's for sure. I mean, I've been enjoying wearing those different hats, and that's part of the excitement of being in a startup. People wear multiple hats. You are not just running the business, you're also helping change the business and evolve the business. And Clari has changed so many times since I've joined, from 4 or 5 people that we were to years ago to 35. The challenges are different, the product is different, the market has evolved, and it's been fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. So cool. So you're Brian as the SE person, and we were discussing this before the podcast started. I always say that I should always press the record button even before we're recording, because sometimes that's where some of the insights come actually. So we were discussing before we pressed the record button that you started as an SE and you still are the SE. That's like your main role, but kind of as you just mentioned, from a startup world, you're doing multiple hats, and you've moved into operations a little bit more. What kind of operations are you doing, and are they related to sales engineering? Are they related to more RevOps? Are they related to more just getting things done? Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think the getting things done is probably a good description of the operations bucket that I wear whilst we're growing Clari in Europe. The hat really varies. I think it's partly the unique combination of the background, trying to weave in all the experiences I've had in Switzerland at Accenture and in Salesforce. And sometimes it's revenue operations. classic territory planning. That's what we did in sort of December, November time last year. We were really focused on which markets do we target, which accounts are good, which are not, and having somebody who's feet on the ground here is really helpful for our actual RevOps team in the US. They're amazing what they do. They work really closely together. And it's good that they have this additional input from somebody like me who knows technically a bit what's happening, but also knows the market a bit, has traveled around and knows how different customers work. So that's been tremendously helpful in sort of Q4 as we're planning the new fiscal year. And it's been a fantastic learning experience for me as well, learning from them who do it every day, all day, because that's just in the end part of the day in my role. And eventually we will get a RevOps person in Europe, and then that person can do all that magical stuff. And then it evolves, then we win a lot of customers in Q4, and then it's all about how do we transition now well to professional services, ensure that they go to value very quick, and we can then upsell at some point to them. So that's where I worked closely with our professional services team. And I was like, how can we improve the transition from pre-sales to post-sales? How do we get customers value very quick? What are the learnings we have to apply to the sales cycles now in order to do a better job post-sales again? And it's just nice that lens on as well, whilst now I'm leading the team that's still running the SE organization and function here. So that's sort of multifacetedness, and I think as companies grow, you get more specific in what you do. But we're kind of on that journey at the moment, and there's still plenty to do and plenty to wear multiple hats on.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it sounds like you really enjoy wearing multiple hats. If you didn't enjoy wearing multiple hats, it sounds like it would be terrible, but it sounds like you really enjoy it.
I do enjoy it. Exactly. Yes, exactly. Not for everybody, but I do certainly enjoy
it. I think most of our listeners like wearing multiple hats. I feel like that's a RevOps kind of role. If you're like, or even CRO role, just relationships, but also getting things done and also working with different teams. So I definitely feel like our listeners can connect to that. So really interesting. Thank you. I think we can deep dive into two of those things. Really three of those things. So one is going global and that territory planning outside of America. I would love to discuss that. The other thing you mentioned beyond territory planning was going from pre-sales to post-sales. I think would be cool to talk about for 5-10 minutes. And then the last thing we could talk about would be just going SE to ops in general. But let's go one by one. So let's do territory planning. What can you tell people, our listeners most of them are based in the US, or in, if they wanted to do territory planning into Europe, and they have a few people in Europe already, it's not their first hire, not their first sales hire, what do they need to do? What should be the strategy? What's important for them to know before they even get started?
Yeah, there's lots that we've probably learned in the past few years. A few tactical things, right? A few tactical things for anybody in RevOps in the US thinking about expansion into Europe. Data is not so great for European companies. If you buy from ZoomInfo or you buy it from another source, it's just hard, right? The landscape is so scattered, different countries, different laws, different languages. You will not get the precision on the data to run excellent territory planning. So you need to account for that. You need to build in a buffer, or you need to just be conscious of how that will pan out with the sales team as you deploy the territories into different teams that you have in Europe. So I think tactically, be mindful of the data gap that you have in Europe. And as you think about that, you need to build in buffer and factor that into your territories. I think that's sort of a very tactical thing we've learned. Super important. I think that the next thing is, as you think about the different countries, they are much different than the different states in the US. It's very different to sell to UK versus France versus Israel, where you are, Sweden or Finland, than selling compared to Boston region versus New York region, right? These are different states in the US. They're more similar probably than the countries in Europe. So you have to definitely account for that as well as you build your books. You can't just give it to somebody. Here's all of Europe. That might work for certain industries, and if you're in tech, everybody speaks English. That's fine. But as soon as you're selling into manufacturing, you have to have a French speaker in France. You have to have a German speaker in Germany. And that's a very important nuance as well that people sometimes forget as well. So these are kind of the two things. And then I think everybody in RevOps who runs a good RevOps organization, they do have that feedback loop with the field. And I think this is just a strategic decision to always nurture that feedback loop. I mean, our RevOps people in the US, they're amazing. They always are asking us like, hey, Semir, what is happening in Europe? Does this make sense? What do you think about this approach? And they do the same for the different stakeholders they engage with. They really want to do a good job, and they're really curious learners. And they especially try to learn a lot from Europe as well, because it is so different. You have to learn more. And that's really helped us build a good team and a good go-to-market motion, create good territories that reps, when they get them, also feel confident about that they can, hit the ground running and have a successful year. So that's more on the strategic side. I think what I find interesting in going global and how it affects territory management, territory planning.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I was kind of curious, you mentioned that you have an amazing RevOps team. So first of all, shout out to your RevOps team. But is it planned like once a week I have a call with Semir, or is it more just on the fly, like, oh, I'm doing this new thing, I should reach out to Semir just to get his opinion, or I'm in the middle of something, I'm starting it, I'm going to reach out to Semir? What's usually the relationship with that, and what what do you think do they get the most out of it when they have that type of relationship?
Got it. Yeah, I think so. I have my weekly touch point with our revenue operations person in the US, and that's when we go through just what's top of mind, be it a Salesforce report, be it how the team is doing, be it how the new rep that's joining, the book that he or she will get. So that's a weekly touch point. So very frequent in that sense. There is more collaboration definitely in Q4, as also with the sales leaders around building the territories. So we will have definitely much more in terms of collaboration going on there. But just the need, I mean, we went from, as I said, 4 or 5 people, I think 14, 15 months ago, to 35 people now, most of them in the go-to-market function somewhere. So, there's new books to be built, to be deployed. There's assessment like, hey, does this work, what we've done? Is there a gap anywhere in what we've done? So this constant interaction is needed. I think some teams might require less and some a bit more, but I'm keeping sort of my weekly touch point. And it's good to have that, I think. Even if you might learn things, especially when you don't have a full agenda necessarily, you just might talk a bit about stuff, because you also want to hear what's working in the US, what are they doing, and what could be applied here. So yeah, for me, it's the weekly touch point that works really well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And on a related note, do you have weekly touch points with sales engineers in the States? Are those insights shared globally?
Yeah, so we, of course, the sales engineering leadership team, we meet up on a weekly basis as well. I mean, that's in the end, the majority of my job is focusing on the sales engineers, make sure they accelerate deals, make deals bigger, work with the sales reps in the most effective way they can. And then there's all these adjacent functions. I mean, in the new market, as I said, enablement is one I work with at the moment. Again, with so much growth, you have to enable people to effectively position and to transform what comes from product marketing into field-ready pitches and presentations. And that's currently one of my focuses, let's say, in that operations bucket. And it varies all the time, but it's good to have that kind of one-stop shop, if you want, through me, and then have it dispersed into other teams. So that's been fun, and yeah, it varies.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's very interesting. So now let's talk about pre-sales to post-sales. You mentioned that was a task that you've been working on in the past 15 months. Tell us, I guess, maybe some of the pain points and some of the obstacles, and how you got through some of those obstacles.
Yeah, I mean, this is so interesting. I mean, I love that pre to post-sales transition, because that's when we, all these promises on PowerPoints and POCs and demos, they come to reality, right? And I've seen that at Accenture, how, Salesforce can sell something, now you then have to implement it, and how reality hits the dream, and sometimes it's a bit too far off. And I want to make sure that that's as close as possible and delivered as fast as possible. So time to value has been very critical. So when I joined, we didn't have a post-sales team. We just, implemented through the US with the time zone gap. And I was trying to stitch together as much as I could in terms of keeping the customer interaction healthy, being there as a person of contact as well during European hours if they had questions. And then over time, we started to put in processes in place, regular touch points for the post-sales team. I would help them understand who the customers are, what their pain points are, really do extra deep transitions if you want. We go through different calls we've had, different slides, and do maybe a bit of extra, but that was needed because of the time zone difference already. You would have a bit of a disconnect. So wherever you can make that gap a bit smaller, I was like over investing into that to make sure that it would work. And then there's a cultural gap as well. You know, if you have a team implementing in California and you have a German team who wants an implementation to be very precise and organized and ready and planned through, you know, helping bridge that and say, look, that's how that customer works. That's what they're used to. So we just need to approach it from that perspective as well. So we deliver the best experience. And that's been great. And then we started hiring an implementation team. I helped coach and mentor some of the people who got onboarded in that team. And now they're pretty self-sufficient and running well, implementing customers on a continuous basis. And we're evolving as a company too. So it's nice to see that transition from having nobody here who does professional services and implementations and post-sales to having a whole team in customer success and implementations and processes and a bit of structure. And I can't wait for what it'll look like in a few years when we're even bigger and better organized.
Yeah, it comes down, it sounds like it comes down to that, like culture differences, just expectations, explainability, things that we've heard about, or I think a lot of our listeners have read about, you know, differences in cultures, and then just acting on that. It's sometimes like you read in a book, you're like, oh, it's probably overstated. But then I speak to people and I'm like, nope, it's not overstated. You have to explain more to these people in this country. You have to be more.
It's exactly like that sometimes, yeah.
So it's really interesting and really wild. What's one, I guess, maybe surprising thing without like obviously or like saying anything bad about Clari, but what's one thing that in that process was surprising, or what's one thing that it could be a good thing? What's one thing that you wish you knew beforehand, before 4 to 15 months ago when you were working with them?
Yeah, oh, that's a good question. I mean, I've learned so much. It's been a fantastic journey. I've grown so much personally and professionally as well. I think what I learned, I mean, there's so many things. I think one thing I've learned is just collaboration, again, with the US for me, right? I worked at an American company before, was Salesforce, but they were already hugely established in Europe and in London. So the cultural difference would be much smaller. But I think working with people in the US, I understood also the other way around, how I work with my manager effectively, or how I work with the US team effectively, where I think that's really important as well. It's not just, hey, they need to understand things are different in Europe. The Americans, they don't get it. It's different here. You can't sell like this into Holland or into France. But it also goes the other way. Like, you know, what does my manager expect? What is the mindset that they have about approaching go-to-market? And I think it goes both ways, right? It goes both ways, especially if you're early days in a market. So for anybody in RevOps who will deploy their first talent to Europe in the next 6 or 12 months, the learning has to go both ways. And I think that has to be encouraged. And that's really important. That's why it's good to have somebody who's maybe worked with an American company, has a bit of an idea that things are different, or somebody who's done it before, of course. So that's, when you look at hiring, I think a key thing, like, have they done this before? Have they worked so internationally before? And I think that's sort of one thing that probably surprised me a bit, that it goes both ways.
Yeah, no, and by the way, for your, I would say it's even for your benefit that you recognize that early and that you're able to work on that communication. I guess that goes with like everything in all relationships, whether it be sales, whether it not be sales, whether it be work internally. But it's really interesting, and it's a good point, especially for someone that doesn't live in the States. It's funny that you mentioned that. I recently was speaking to some friends in America, and they said that they mentioned the Israeli company they're working at now, and they're like, the company we were before was also Israeli. I'm like, what's going on here? And it's like, is this an accident? They're like, no, we like that culture. Like, that's what we want to work with. So there are culture differences, and it doesn't just matter for sales and explainability and being better at GDPR. It's also good and very important for internal relationships. So that's absolutely important and a great point. The third thing I wanted to bring up with you was what we mentioned was sales engineer to ops. Really interesting. One of the reasons I even reached out was because I saw that was your background on LinkedIn. So I'm glad you put that on your LinkedIn. So then I could target you for the podcast. But sales engineering and ops, what it seems like it's you fell kind of into the ops because you're in Europe and you're really informed and you're really smart, and then they probably wanted you. But would love to hear more about that, moving more into ops. Obviously, you're still in sales engineering, but would love to hear more about that relationship with sales engineering and ops and what you've seen in the ecosystem of sales engineers and ops.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's sort of one of my pet projects, or something I really love to spend more time in, is developing people and cultures, and how they nourish the learning and how people progress new career paths. I think that's amazing. I think, and I've seen it at Clari, I've seen it at Salesforce, and the SE, the sales engineering, pre-sales, or solution engineering career path is one that lends itself to many other facets of the business, right? Because SEs are naturally very curious. They love the technology and how it benefits business. They have to constantly learn more, new product, new capability, new launch, whatever the case. They have to learn. They have to learn about the customer, their pains, their issues, their problems. And naturally with that, they always seek to learn more. And we've had it at Clari. We've had people that go into product management, go into marketing, they go into strategy. And I have now kind of started embarking on a path as well, where I do a bit of operations, and who knows where that will lead to. Maybe I do more of that as I grow my career. And it's just a fantastic thing to see as people develop into that. I think I have a friend, his name is Adam Freeman. He used to just be in an SE leadership role at the company, and now he is leading not just SEs, but he's also kind of in charge of enablement and many other aspects of the go-to-market. Another person I know is a guy called Martin at a company, and he moved from SE leader to being the RevOps leader, because as the SE, he saw the go-to-market teams, he saw the different AEs and styles of how they work, he saw what resonates, what doesn't resonate, and the product and where the gaps are, and he could then effectively help bridge that by moving into that role. And then you even see SEs go into sales. Our own CRO, Kevin Canerian, he used to be a sales engineer, and he's now our CRO. And that really inspires me to just think about, hey, what could be next? What's the next fun thing that I could do? What's the next fun thing that my team could do? I have team members, they were in sales. I have a team member who was a Salesforce consultant before, and now they're all SEs, and in 3-4 years' time, there'll be something else maybe again. And that's just very inspiring to see. And I love to see people grow and pursue their passions. And I think SE is a great chapter in many people's careers, and sometimes it's the only thing they want to do as well, which is great too, because there is always things you can learn as an SE and as you embark on the career in sales engineering.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I'm really glad you're our first sales engineer on our podcast, so I could really.
That's cool. Thank you for having me. As I said, yeah, it's fantastic.
And I think it's really interesting for our audience and our listeners to hear. And it sounds like you're doing great things for Clari. It sounds like it's nice to hear about their expansion. A lot of RevOps, I'm sure, of our listeners even use Clari. So I hope that's helpful also for them. And I'm looking forward to staying in touch. And thanks for an awesome podcast.
Thank you, Barry. Have a fantastic day. See you soon.
And thanks for an awesome podcast.